All right, we are standing here in the berms that we've created in our designated orchard space. And when I took you through here last, it was a bit of a dismal day, and it was actually a dismal day here. It's really windy. I'm probably gonna lose my hat over this. But you could see, we actually started safeguarding the trees. Sandra came in here and did these basically quick and dirty plant pots with cocoa fiber and tape, and has safeguarded the trees from the spongy moth, AKA gypsy moths. And you can see the leaves are a little bit eaten, but there's no more caterpillars on here. I actually came through here, was it yesterday or 2 days ago, and knocked off any last remaining ones. But you may recall that we actually did these berms when we had the Cayuga landscape over, and they brought over the compost topsoil mix and they pushed it out, and it wasn't straight lines. So being the perfectionists that we are, we came in here and put some posts and ran a string line and actually filled it in more with a compost topsoil, put another layer of compost on top, thin layer of compost, and then remulched the beds. And then, thanks for the suggestions, because we ran out of cardboard and somebody said get painter's paper. I know that's not going to really prevent weeds from coming through because it's actually quite thin. But I did just run the painter's paper along the line, and all of that wonderful wood chips that we got from clearing out some of the dying and diseased trees, we ended up using around the edges just for a little bit more of weed prevention. I suggested wood chips through all these pathways walking through, but you actually liked, the grass and the idea of like mowing it down. But I wanted to have some barrier of weeds so that they would have at least a little less chance of moving in here. And what's nice about having a little barrier like this is when you come in and you mow or you weed whack, it doesn't necessarily fly back onto the bed, even though that wouldn't be the worst thing in the world, because some of this stuff is actually good nitrogen and you could put grass clippings and everything on it, but we like keeping a relatively clean bed, if you will.
That's another thing. We could mow these paths and then take the grass that we collect and throw it on the sides.
Yeah, for sure.
Building up that layer of protection.
For sure. And one of the things that I think is actually really important that sometimes we maybe don't pay so much attention to is actually letting your weeds grow out for a little bit. And weeds are just really plants in a place that you don't want, right? And they could be native plants, they could be naturalized, they could be introduced, they could be exotic, however you want to describe them. Not all of them are as bad as you make them out to be. What I want to talk about today is weeds. And part of the weeds that you'll get are obviously what is growing in your natural environment and surrounding environment. And what is here is going to be our low meadow fading into high meadow. So we're always going to get some type of plant pressure from the outside. And what you could see here is as I was going through, I started to pull out some of the grasses, hopefully by the root, but not always. Here's some of our clovers. Here, right here, you see is a very yellow looking Olearia petiolata. So that's one of the garlic mustards that's coming through. So as I had been weeding this, I started to take note of those particular weeds, and I have my book here so I don't forget any. So the main one that I was seeing was that garlic mustard, and that again is an introduced plant. And it is actually one of the few introduced plants that has no problem pushing into a relatively intact forest. Now, some people may say garlic mustard, it was brought here, I believe it was brought here as an edible. It is an edible plant, so even if you don't want it growing in your bed, if it's something that you think you could actually harvest, then that might actually be fine for you of having it push into some of your beds. For me, it's not so much. And part of the reason why is that it's absolutely pervasive here. And it's slightly pernicious, but not in the way that maybe we originally thought it was. But what some of the studies have found out is that we do have a native Lepidoptera, so a native Pyrrhus butterfly, that does actually lay its eggs on the garlic mustard, but it can't complete its life cycle. So that is something that I'd like to actually remove, at least from the orchard beds. Additionally, some of the studies have shown that as it pushes more into the forest, there's a correlation of less leaf litter. And I think what happens is that for some reason there is a garlic mustard and earthworms kind of go together. And we think of earthworms, we often think, hey, that's good because they're aerating the soil and everything along those lines. But a lot of the non-native worms will actually eat the leaf litter. So in the forest, you want some of that leaf litter, right? Well, in the forest, when the leaf litter gets eaten by the worms, which has this correlation of garlic mustard and more worms, then you have less leaf litter and you actually then have less native salamanders and things along those lines. So those are some of the factors that may come into play when you're noticing weeds. The other weed that I thought was, I would say, the most aggressive within the bed was the lamb's quarters. And I always thought that lamb's quarters was native because it was so, again, pervasive in every neighborhood, in every crack and crevice, and every sidewalk that I've ever visited before. And it is in the Amaranthaceae family, and anybody who has ever planted amaranth or any place that I've ever seen amaranth grow, it is something that really grows exceptionally well and seeds like crazy. So I'll see if I could actually find, I noticed it in our lawn. Oh, here's one. No, that's not one. Hold on. We'll find it. But they were very small, and what's great about the mulch and mulching your beds is that as they start to move in, you'll be able to actually yank them out pretty easily. And I was able to actually weed all the whole berms within an hour. But one thing about the lamb's quarters is that it is also an edible. I mean, many people in various different countries will actually eat lamb's quarters. So you could eat it like a spinach green. In fact, I was actually going to forage some for our salad, from our yard tonight. And then it actually produces a seed that people can harvest, very similar to amaranth. And I think quinoa is also in the amaranth family, so very similar to that. So again, if it's something that you don't mind that's actually growing and something that you could forage your weeds, because it is a very nutritious weed after all, then that is something that you could actually, do. But it is very persistent in the soil, so the seed could last for quite a long time. And that's unfortunate because, as much as you weed, especially with all this wind kind of blowing everywhere, you're most likely going to get it in your bed. So the next one I would say is Oxalis stricta, which is actually a native plant. So this might be our native oxalis. It could be a white Dutch clover, which was one of the other ones. You'll see the Dutch clover right here, the white clover, which again kind of pushes a bit more into the bed. It's a nitrogen fixer. Again, they're actually edible plants. And this was something that I didn't really see so much in the bed, but it's one of those ones that I'm not so worried about. It kind of creeps along the ground. It's a great nitrogen fixer. If you have a lot of clover in your lawn and you put your lawn clippings in an area of your garden bed that you want to have more nutrients, then that's actually a positive thing. So out of all the, quote unquote weeds that I didn't actually intend to plant in here, both that oxalis and this white clover are not a big deal for me. Another thing that I saw a lot of, speaking of nitrogen fixers, but only on the edges of the bed, is this. Now this is Medicago, it's black medic. And again, this is an introduced species. It kind of spreads rhizomatically really close to the ground, so it's pretty easy to kind of pull up out of the ground. And the reason why you could pay attention to your weeds is that once you see, if this is growing more along the edges of your bed, this is a great sign to know that there's not enough nitrogen in your soil. And again, it's a nice nitrogen fixer. It wasn't growing in the bed. So it then tells me that I probably have a good amount of nitrogen in the bed. So that's one of the things that I think I only found 2 of these growing in the bed. And then I was like, okay, well, that's some place where maybe that we need more nitrogen fixing plants in that particular area of the bed. So the reason why nitrogen fixing plants are important is that nitrogen is the main macronutrient for plant health. Now there's so many different macro and micronutrients that plants need to fulfill their life cycle, but when you think about fertilizers, you think of N, P, and K. Now those are not the only macronutrients that you should think of, but that's nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. But nitrogen is definitely the main macronutrient, and it's one of the ones that if your plant is starting to look a little yellow, a little chlorotic, have a general malaise, it usually needs a boost of nitrogen. Now I'm thinking this could be an early stage lamb's quarters. Very hard to know, but I'll pull out another one that's more mature so you could see what it looks like, because obviously when they're just seedlings, you don't get a sense of what they look like. But look,
when it's nitrogen fixing, that's when it fixes the nitrogen that's missing.
So when you have a nitrogen fixing plant, plants can't get nitrogen in the form that it is within the soil unless it's actually broken down by some other organisms. And oftentimes, like a bacteria within the soil will actually break down the nitrogen. So oftentimes nitrogen fixing plants could actually take the nitrogen out of the atmosphere. There's these little nodules on the roots, and those are actually in symbiosis with some bacteria that could then, break that down. And when you have plants that are nitrogen fixing, when you actually cut those plants or when you pull the roots out and then you kind of lay them on top of the soil, that nitrogen gets to be a form that other plants can actually pull up. So when you're developing kind of an idea of guilds, when you could think about permaculture principles, these guilds, these plants are working in unison with one another. Oftentimes you will have nitrogen fixing plants with plants that can't fix nitrogen. And then you'll have kind of plants that will act as like a living mulch. You'll have plants that will bring in pollinators. You'll have plants that will bring in, insects that will fight off bad insects. And that's another important thing I should know, actually, now that I mentioned that point. One of the things about lamb's quarters that kind of turned me off, and also with the garlic mustard, is that it attracts pests that could actually harm your other fruit and vegetable trees. As a matter of fact, an interesting thing that I noticed as I was picking out weeds, because oftentimes when we're picking out weeds, we're just kind of like, ripping them out of the ground and be like, stupid weeds. But one of the things that I noticed as I was hand picking some of these weeds is that actually I found a lot of ladybug larvae, and it was primarily on the lamb's quarters. So you may say, well, the lamb's quarters is good to have because it's attracting some of those ladybugs, but I'd rather those ladybugs to be on my fruit trees. So clearly to me that ladybug is attacking some type of pestiferous insect that is being attracted by the actual lamb's quarters. So these are just things that you should take note of and not be afraid to actually let some of these weeds flush out within your bed so that you could learn from them and say, okay, well, when I'm planting and planning my guilds within this bed, which I'm still developing, which plants can actually fill the niche that those unwanted plants are filling. So for instance, some of those nitrogen fixers, the medicago or the clover, could be maybe a baptisia, and that's one of the ones that I'm actually bringing in here is a Baptisia australis variation minor, which is a nitrogen fixing plant. It gets a really beautiful kind of blue pea-shaped flower. It's a native, and I have to think about what are the plants that are going to be okay to spread into the meadow that I wouldn't mind spreading into the meadow, because just because the plants are in the berm here now, it doesn't mean 1, 2, 3, 5, 10, 50 years from now that they're not going to spread into the meadow. So within these guilds, I'm really taking that into account and figuring out what mostly native plants would I actually like to see in here that I wouldn't actually be fearful that spread into the meadow, and that could actually be helpful to other organisms as well. Let's see what else is in here. So I went through, oh, this one's a tough one. Rumix crispus, which is the curly dock. This is another one that really surprised me. Let's walk over, I'll show you where it is out here. It's way outside the berm now, but this is one that again is very pervasive. And again, this surprises me. I thought this was actually a native plant. Now this is totally an edible plant. I see a lot of aphids on it. So again, it's a plant that attracts a lot of pestiferous insects. And this really started to push into the berm, and you have to be fairly strong when it's at this size to try to pull it out. I'd probably hurt myself trying to pull this out. It is so well rooted in there. It has a root like a carrot, you know, basically. And what that tells me is that this area is probably very compacted, and it tends to come in through the edges of the bed. And when it's small, you'll be able to pull it out. But when it's, you know, this large, it becomes a lot more of a challenge. So you want to try to get them when they're small. But again, something that really attracts the pests. If you want, it is an edible. You can eat the greens, you can eat the seeds, primarily when it's small, but it's not one that we'll be noshing on quite readily. So I'd rather that not push into the beds. But recognizing that this area is really rocky, and that one is attracted to more kind of waste sites, if you will, or recently degraded sites. And so if you have and you bring in some deep rooted plants, maybe you do even bring some carrots in here, then that's something to actually consider. In fact, one of the other weeds that we didn't see that much of was Daucus carota, which is, you know, again, a plant that has naturalized. I wouldn't say that it's an invasive, but it's become an important pollinator plant, and that is wild carrot. In fact, I pulled out a couple the other day. I'm telling you, I can't even really find the ones that I'm referring to here, but I found one the other day and I pulled it out, and it has, here's one. So this is going to be the wild carrot, and I pulled one out the other day, and it had the sweetest smell of a carrot. I won't be able to pull this one out. I probably won't be able to pull it without my tools. Hard to pull them out. This one will have it's a tiny little carrot. But when they're the right size, you can pull them out, and they're edible, but they're not edible in the same way that our carrots are intensely sweet that we've cultivated over the years. Another one that we see here is the broadleaf plantain. So the plantago, I mean, this is everywhere. It was known as white man's footprint because wherever they actually cleared the land, this emerged. And that's really true here, especially in this meadow. But this again is a plant that really wasn't pushing too much into the bed. It was along the edges of the bed. It comes into these really well compacted areas, and it's an important medicinal as well. So if you get any kind of wasp sting or bee sting, if you just kind of crush this up and let the juice, and then put that onto your cut or onto your wasp sting, that will really help extract some of that poison out of your skin. So that's another one that I wasn't really too worried about as I was like walking through and seeing these weeds. Another one is, let's see. Well, I think that's about it. I think we had some grasses, but I feel like that's totally normal because we have so much grass pressure here. One of the other things that I didn't, this is another nitrogen fixer. It could be a real problem because it could strangle the plants that you've done. It's very rhizomatous, so it kind of spreads like very superficially on the ground, but it's not one that I've saw in the bed, surprisingly. Also bindweed, we don't really have much of that, knock on wood, here. So I did see like one or two, but it wasn't even enough for me to actually put it in my my little notebook here and say that that was something important. But now that I see and have seen and witnessed all the weeds that have moved into the bed, this is where I can now start thinking about guilds and saying, okay, well, what are the nitrogen fixers that I would like in this bed that I wouldn't mind actually spreading out into the environment? So like I said, that Baptisia was something that was really interesting to me. There's an Amorpha plant that is also nitrogen fixer that would be, again, a good pollinator. So plants that actually fulfill multiple aspects of a guild, like something that could be a living mulch as well as a pollinator plant, is definitely something that would, you know, get 2 points in my book. Some other ones that we're looking at is like our native garlic would be really interesting. Again, not something that is a cultivated garlic, but if we have the wild garlic that's native here and that pushes out a bit more into the meadow, then I would actually prefer that over a cultivated garlic. We also have wild hyacinths. That's something that I'm looking into. It's in the lily family, and that is a bulb you could actually eat, but is a native plant as well. So some of those things might be a little bit more unusual, but once I flesh out those guilds, I'll definitely do an episode on that. I'd imagine I wouldn't start actually planting in earnest until maybe the fall, because there's actually so many more chores to do. And I'm sure I'm going to have to weed this bed like another time before the fall season hits. And then I'll be able to learn from that flush of weeds as well. So hopefully this gave you an idea about why we shouldn't be so upset about our weeds, and then we could actually use them to help us tell what's happening in our beds.
Killdeer?
Yeah, let's go see the killdeer. Let's see if the eggs have hatched at all. So he's pretending that his wing is injured to detract us away from his nest, or her nest. Okay, let her be. I feel bad. Okay, hope your wing gets better.